Mr. Beat here. Thanks for being here this afternoon. It is Monday, February 9th, and if you've been following me on social media, you know I've been trying to reach my representative in Congress in the House of Representatives. Um, oh, I have another window open. Okay, so I have not been able to get a hold of my U.S. representative, unfortunately, other than one canned response. And the issue I've been trying to reach him about is uncapping the House, which is an issue I'm very passionate about. I've become more of an activist with this issue in recent months. In fact, I've been writing my congressman every single day in 2026 about this. And so what's that? 37 days now straight of doing this. It's starting to wear on me a little bit, but I'm hanging in there. But yeah, I'm getting others to contact their members of Congress, and it just seems like it's an issue that not a lot of people are bringing up. And then lo and behold, the other day, I think it was last Thursday, I get a bunch of people messaging me, Mr. B, you should check out this video. And it's a Vox video, and it's promoting a bill to uncap the House, which I didn't even know existed. I'm kind of embarrassed to say I didn't even know this bill existed. And so I looked it up, and sure enough, it does that. It also does other things. There's other bills related to it. But the congressman who has sponsored this bill, I am fortunate enough to have the opportunity to interview him here shortly. So before I bring the congressman out here, I want to introduce him. His name is Sean Casten. He represents the 6th District of Illinois, a district that my sister-in-law used to live in, actually. And so I already knew about him because of her, enthusiastically supporting him. But yeah, this bill that he has introduced is called the Equal Voices Act, HR 4125. It was introduced last summer, actually. It's been around. But as most of you already know, most bills die, or most bills mostly rest. They don't really go anywhere. They don't even make it to committee. Especially most of them don't make it to a vote. But we're going to change that today because we're hoping to build up some momentum and publicity for this. So I want everyone to give a warm welcome for Congressman Sean Casten. Got to unmute your mic. Sorry. I can't unmute it.
There we go. I'm there. Okay. How are you?
Great. How are you doing today?
I'm great. Can I call you Mr. Beat, or you Sir Beat, Lord Beat? What would you prefer?
Oh, I like Sir Beat. No, you can call me whatever you want. Mr. Beat is what I'm known on the internet as. Yeah, there's only confusion because people mix me up with that other guy, Mr. Beast, but okay. You may have heard of him. Yeah. But regardless, I really appreciate you coming on today. I know you're a busy guy, but it was just so super cool to see the Vox video, and that video is doing well. It has like 500,000 views. And for the first time, so many Americans are being introduced to this idea of uncapping the House. And so my first question for you, Congressman, is how did you first find out about this idea yourself?
So it's a great question. And I am, I think I was in my second or third term, and I was just getting more and more frustrated that there are so many things where we bring forward in the House that are supported by our voters, and then they never become law. And they never become law because of structures of our government that our founders designed to block the will of the majority. Like our founders thought that none of us were sophisticated enough to vote for president. We need electors, and the Electoral College do that. Our founders thought that none of us were sophisticated enough to vote for senators. We had to amend the Constitution to give ourselves that authority. Our founders thought that if you weren't a white Christian property holding man, you shouldn't vote at all, right? And so we have gradually expanded democracy, but so many of the things that the public looks and says, well, if these things are supported by the public and you're not doing them, it must be because you're corrupt or you're cynical, or you don't care about people. And they don't realize that it's actually the structure of our government that overrepresents particularly rural voters, and overrepresents land at the expense of people. And so we sort of sat down to saying, what can we do to make our ostensibly democratic government more democratic? And so we introduced a series of bills. We've got one to reform some structures in the Senate. We've got one to reform some structures in the Supreme Court. And on this one, we said, well, let's expand the House. And candidly, I started doing this because the more you expand the House, the more you expand the Electoral College. The more you expand the Electoral College, the less number of scenarios there are where the winner of the popular vote is not the winner of the electoral vote. But then as you start unpeeling this onion, there are so many other sort of problems with our democracy that come from the fact that House districts have become so large. And so that's how we got to this point. And then, of course, you find out that our founders thought that, the first draft of the Constitution said that House districts should never have more than, I want to say, was it 50,000 or 30,000? In any event, we'd have about 6,000 members of Congress if that had survived the initial draft of the Bill of Rights. So maybe just as well, but they were onto something. That it's a little crazy to say every time the population grows, we just represent more people instead of providing more representation.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought up the other bills that also are kind of paired with this bill. I pulled up. Let me pull this up actually here on your website. You're very transparent with your constituents. I appreciate that. So yeah, this is a package really. If you want to maybe, so not only are you calling to increase the size of the House of Representatives, but also the Senate. So I found this fascinating, like a 12 at-large senators to be elected through a national popular vote. Like how would that work?
So on that one, there's this weird self-destruct button in Article 5 of the Constitution. Article 5 is what describes how you can amend the Constitution. And it says you expressly cannot amend the Constitution in any way that would reduce the relative power of the senators, which is to say our founders kind of knew that the Senate is this deeply anti-democratic institution. and remember, our founders were like, I kind of like the slaves. I want to hold on to those slaves. People, that's not a popular idea. I need the Senate to protect me from that. And so we said, all right, so if we've got that self-destruct button in the Constitution, how would we fix it anyway? So we said, well, why don't we add 12 national senators, which would bring it to roughly 10% of the Senate would now be responsive to popular public will. Doesn't fix everything, but if we had that block, you would then have a Senate that needs to be more responsive and start to correct some of the imbalances. The classic example is Wyoming, 570,000 people, and they get just as many senators as California at 30 million. That's insane, but it means that the Senate has always been vastly more responsive to the issues of rural America than to the issues that animate Americans. And that's the Senate side, that's not the House side. But as you think about like what it means as House districts have gotten larger, it has some of the same effect, because where are people moving? Well, by definition, they're in the most population dense areas. Well, if our districts keep getting bigger, that means that you've got a lot of members who increasingly are responsive to the more rural parts of their district. And this is not in any way to criticize rural America, right? But if we are supposed to be representative, shouldn't we make sure that the interests represented in Congress are consistent with the interests represented by voters? And so, because districts have become so big, it has had the effect of magnifying the problems baked into the Senate of overrepresenting land at the expense of people.
Absolutely. If you're an American watching this right now, listening to it, odds are you're probably someone who lives in a town or city. Over 80% of Americans live in an urban area or suburban area. And I think this is something that was really bad like 100 years ago. That's one of the reasons why we had a kind of a cap to begin with at 435 in the House, was that you had rural folks that were worried about losing their power because they realized that like the 1920s was the first time that more people were living in cities versus on farms. And don't forget, it was also the Great Migration. So you had a lot of African Americans who'd been historically disenfranchised for other reasons that were moving to cities. And so if you were going to have a representative country, that means you'd have to actually give representation to people regardless of their skin color. And that wasn't a real popular idea 100 years ago. Yeah. These reform. Okay. So let me go back to this package real quick, and then we'll go back to uncapping the House, because that's obviously my main passion here. But I mean, I have some viewers that want to get rid of the Senate entirely, and I don't go that far. I think that the Senate has a good reason to exist. So I do think this is kind of a compromise in that regard, and like say, hey, keep the Senate. They're supposed to represent the states, but maybe like insert a little bit more democracy into it. But the other part of this is the Supreme Court. So do you want to explain how that would work with the Supreme Court?
Yeah. So, and again, this is all powers that, exist within the Constitution. The Article 3, which of course creates the court system, says that the original jurisdiction of the Supreme Court, that is to say, cases that originate in the Supreme Court and stay there, are narrowly defined as matters relating to admiralty law, maritime law, issues relating to ambassadors, disputes between the states, and such appellate jurisdiction as Congress may provide. So the Supreme Court has no innate authority to be the top appellate court, except that Congress has deeded them that authority. Now, if like me, you think that Clarence Thomas and Samuel Alito are really, really smart legal scholars when it comes to matters of admiralty law, maritime law, and issues relating to ambassadors, but are perhaps less qualified when it comes to things like the Voting Rights Act, making sure that people are protected from an out-of-control administration, ICE officers, all that other sort of stuff. Congress has the ability to take that away because it's right there in the Constitution. Such appellate jurisdiction as Congress can provide. So what we've said is, let's create a senior appellate court as distinct from the Supreme Court. That court would be staffed by judges randomly selected from all the senior appellate courts in the country. So you can't politically pack that court. You don't know who will be assigned to a given trial, but you've got dozens of judges who would be eligible to opine on that case, and create a system where that group of people are then the appellate jurors. So take the politics out of the senior appellate court. Get rid of the incentives to say, well, I'm going to create a test case because I just found out that my justice got confirmed. And so this case that never would have passed before will now maybe go through, and essentially give us a tool as legislators when people say, well, what are you doing to stand up to the Supreme Court? There's a lazy answer to that question that says, well, I believe in checks and balances and co-equal branches, and I am not in the judicial branch, so I can't comment on that. I think this is a more thoughtful approach to say, well, the Constitution specifically gives the legislative branch the ability to constrain what the judicial branch can do. And so we're just asserting our legislative powers within the Constitution in ways that are appropriate and necessary for this moment, and responsive to the politicization of the courts that's happened.
Exactly. I really like how you keep stressing how we don't need an amendment to the Constitution to do all of this. This is all perfectly legal in the Constitution. People forget that the size of the Supreme Court has shrank and expanded throughout American history. At one point it had 12, another point it had 6. I mean, it's I get tired of folks saying, oh, it's never going to change. Why would it change? Like it's always been changing. Nothing is static. And we said this before we went live, like we were kind of talking about, okay, say there are actually like not just majorities of Democrats, or maybe, dare I say, a supermajority returns. That's the time to make true reforms. But also you could probably get a few Republicans on your side, because a lot of this stuff is not really partisan. It's not going to necessarily help one party or the other. I think we forget that a lot of people that live in rural areas also aren't Republican. There's just all these kind of stereotypes, I think, that float around. But this is something these are reforms that are meant to help everyone. Would you not agree with that? Like, this is not partisan.
Well, it's not, but it is. And the reason I say both of those is the argument I've made to my Republican colleagues who I find myself having similar values to, not all of them, but some, is that because our founders created this system where the House of Representatives is the most representative body in our government, not perfect, but the most representative. The Senate is intentionally designed to be non-representative. And of course, the courts are lifetime appointments. And we have the Electoral College, which is, as we know, in some recent elections, doesn't always pick the winner of the popular vote. The result of that is that you basically have two ways to gain power in Washington. The first way is you gain the support of the majority of the American people, in which case you will in all likelihood control the House. The other way is you effectuate a strategy to gain control of the minoritarian institutions, which says you can control the Senate. And we have, and I think at various times in our history, sometimes the Democratic Party has been the one that controlled the minoritarian institutions. Today, that's the Republican Party. But it creates this tension. And what I've argued to my Republican colleagues, and some of them are receptive, even if they're not signed on the bills yet, is wouldn't you like to live in a world where we're both playing the same game?
That's what I meant when I said nonpartisan.
Where you're not forced to go back home to your district and your voters are saying, why are you consistently voting against things that the public wants? And the answer is, well, because my power comes from gaining access to the minoritarian institutions, not doing things that the majority wants. The more we weaken the minoritarian institutions and make them more majoritarian, the more likely we find ourselves in an election where you say, if my choice didn't win, the second best candidate did win. And the reason why you see such a gap right now is because we're playing two different games. And that's really, I think that's the argument. And that's why I say it's sort of partisan, sort of not partisan, is that so much of the Republican Party's power's strength right now comes from those control of the minoritarian institutions. And so it would be the people who are currently in leadership of the Republican Party would have a hard time winning under these changes because it appeals to different sets of values than those structures have selected. Which is not to say that a Republican couldn't win in in an urban district. It would just be a different type of Republican than the ones we have right now.
Yeah, I like how you keep using that word, minoritarian, although it's it's a big word. It's a scary word. I never use that word. I always say minority rule, but I think it is weird to think that if you're a Republican in a minority, like if you are clinging to that minority rule mindset, like, well, a lot of these Republicans are terrified to go to their home districts and hold town halls for that reason, because they know that so many people in their own districts hate their guts. I mean, my representative seems terrified to respond to me. I'm being nice. I'm being professional. You can see every letter I published it. It's not like I'm coming. I only want to talk about this one issue. We don't have to talk about ICE. We don't have to talk about all these other hot button issues like this. Only talk about this. But even then, he seems scared to talk to me. I think we at the root of it, we forget, like you opened up with, what type of government do we have? We're a representative republic. Republic meaning the law above all else, but also we got to be represented. How many Americans actually feel represented right now? Even ones who are, even if you live in a Democrat district and you vote Democrats, I think a lot of people still don't feel represented. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, I mean, yes. And I come back to how we started here. I think at some level, we all understand the bet that, for structural reasons, we have a winner-take-all democracy, which means we're going to have a two-party system. There's no particular value in coming in fifth. And so I think people understand that, if you win 51% of the vote, you're not the person who 49% of the electorate wanted. But that doesn't mean you're not representative, right? You still then are elected to represent everybody in that community. And maybe you're going to have some difference of opinion. I think people understand that. I think the much harder thing is where you do see the cynicism is when people see polling, and I think of things like women's right to control their own bodies, that consistently gets like 2/3 of the electorate in support of that. Campaign finance reform, getting rid of gerrymandering, those have been as high as 90% favorability in the public. Reasonable gun control, background checks, assault weapons bans, like these things are all hugely popular. And then people look at Congress and say, you don't even vote on these things. And the truth is we do, but we vote on them in the House and then they die in the Senate. But we only vote on them in the House when we say Democrats are in control, but we only vote them in the House when people who represent the parts of America where most people live are in control, right? And that then gets down to, if you don't like minoritarian, we'll find some other word, but that gets down to this tension. And I think that then breeds the cynicism where people say, well, I don't really feel like I'm represented because it's not that my views should be my representatives' views, but man, it seems like everybody I know is down with policy option A and you keep doing B.
Let's go back to your bill here. So we don't get too far off in the weeds, but I do want to address some concerns that people have, and they keep bringing these separate issues up. And I always counter them with saying, hey, this is actually a root cause problem, meaning like this will solve a lot of the other problems that we have if we just expand representation. However, there are legitimate concerns. Like, so your bill doesn't say anything about, gerrymandering specifically. There's mixed evidence on this, whether or not it would actually prevent gerrymandering or not. I don't know, frankly. Like, I think there needs to be more research, but at the very least, there's others that say maybe we should pair this with proportional representation as well, or other reforms to make sure that it's truly more representative. So is this just a starting point for you as far as a bill, or as far as, because I know you're concerned about gerrymandering as well. So maybe speak as to gerrymandering.
Yeah. So look, we should get rid of gerrymandering. The gerrymandering is beyond simply the jurisdiction of the federal government, because each individual state is responsible for drawing their maps. Different state constitutions have different rules on what they can do. The federal legislation we've dealt with on gerrymandering is more around creating strong positive incentives, so that if everybody agrees to lay their weapons down at the same time, there's a strong incentive for everybody to do that. But unilateral disarmament is dangerous, as we've seen in everything going on from Texas to California to Virginia right now. So you've got to have everybody agree to lay their weapons at the same time. So yes, let's get rid of gerrymandering, but we're trying to do things that would work in a federal context right now, and don't
without having to amend the Constitution,
and don't depend on other actors, right? To go through. I think at the, and I take your point. I think there's good arguments on either side of, does more seats make it easier or harder to gerrymander? I think in the limiting case, and set aside how we'd fit everybody in the House, the smaller the district, the more sort of homogeneous the population is going to be in terms of their interests, right? And I'm not saying homogeneity is a good thing, but I think the idea of gerrymandering, that I'm going to grab chunks of voters from here, here, and here who are racially similar, economically similar, voting propensity similar, the bigger the districts are, the more the sort of really egregious gerrymanders happen to tie those together. I think the smaller the districts they are, just from a geometry perspective, the less likely we're going to be to say everybody from one side of this district to the other is wildly different, and you drew it around this community in the middle just because the districts get smaller.
That seems intuitive. I just, maybe it's my own bias. I agree with you. Do you have thoughts on proportional representation too?
So what we've actually done in this bill, which is kind of proportional representation, is we've said, and maybe we should walk through, I don't know how much people know this. So we've said that we'll set the size of a House district going forward to be 500,000 people. And then at every census, we'll divide the population by 500,000. That will set the number of seats. Now, that then raises a next question of, well, what happens if a given state has less than 500,000 people? Right now, the smallest state is Wyoming at 570. That wouldn't happen right now, but you're still going to be stuck saying, okay, some states might be slightly overrepresented in this. But you then have a second issue, which is, and we have this issue right now. Suppose that your state has 990,000 people. Do you have one representative or two? Right? What if you have 510,000 people? One representative or two? And ultimately, that's the way that we do that right now, which would still have to be done in this bill, is say the number of seats is set at the population divided by 500,000. We'll then have this complicated mathematical formula of how many districts each state gets, but you're always going to end up with some states that have just one district and some states that have more than one district. And so what we've said in here is that if you are in a state with more than one district, however you got there, that you have the option, number one, to have multi-member districts. So let's say you've got 1 million people. We'll say you as the state can decide, I'm just going to call this one district, but we're going to vote to have 2 people represent the district. And so that does this interesting dynamic with, suppose in your state, you're a 55-45 Democratic state. If that's the case, I can almost guarantee that the second highest vote getter is going to be a Republican. right? So then you would end up creating more bipartisanship because in that multi-member district, you've had those two there. And to your proportional representation question, we've said that if states choose to do that, they can, if they wish, use ranked choice voting so that you could then have some way of getting sort of, some other candidates into the mix and go through and avoid some of the challenges with runoffs because you know that it's going to be in a multi-member district context. And maybe I'm getting too far into the weeds there. But so you do get, in some scenarios of how this could be implemented, you do get some proportional representation that flows through.
Okay. The link to the bill is in the description of this video if you all want to check it out in more detail. But yeah, I mean, the main thing is this would increase the members of the House to approximately what, like
a little over 600.
A little over 600. So see, to me, that's not that big a deal. Even I feel like we said at the beginning, in 1789, we had one rep for every 30,000 constituents, and it was such an important thing that folks like James Madison and George Washington were like, we need to make this really part of the Constitution. It was one of the original Bill of Rights, in fact, Article the First. If it was up to me, we would just add that now, but we can't in the foreseeable, like the near future. So this is the next best thing. I personally like the Wyoming rule because, it's just like, it has a nice ring to it. It's less dorky than cube root rule, but whatever we do, people are like, well, do you want 6,000 members of the House? Yes. Why not? And then so let's get into some of these counter arguments that you typically hear. The first one I hear typically is, well, you want more politicians in there? You really want more politicians? We got to pay them. Where are we going to put them? So what are your response to that?
So number one, politics is the only job where we sort of assume that as the complexity of the job grows, we shouldn't add more talent. Do we have to pay salaries? Yes, of course we have to pay salaries. But if you were running an organization that was growing and getting bigger and bigger and had more and more responsibility, can you imagine if the CEO of that organization said, I will absolutely never increase our headcount? The board would probably fire that CEO, right? Because you're not going to do all things well. And so, I would sort of turn the question on its head of, if we want Congress to be a co-equal branch, why have we allowed the executive branch to grow massively, right? I mean, we've added, when our government was created, we didn't have an IRS, we didn't have a standing army, we didn't have a Department of Energy, we didn't, all of those functions have expanded in the executive branch, and yet the Congress stays largely the same size. So if we're going to effectively balance the executive branch and act as the check we're supposed to be to be fiscally responsible, among other things, why do we artificially constrain ourselves, right? I mean, if you're really concerned about the number of people in government, the number of members of Congress is a rounding error in that problem.
Yeah, that's actually the conservative argument. I mean, I think many conservatives will say the president has gotten too powerful over the years because, obviously, if you're a Republican now, you're okay with Trump having more power. But what about the next guy who's not a Republican? They're still going to have those powers.
I'll give you just a crazy statistic. Of the entire federal budget, the legislative branch represents less than 0.5% of the entire federal budget. So
there you go.
If you doubled us, we'd still be less than 1%. So that's, sure, we should be concerned about bureaucratic bloat, but it ain't in the legislative branch.
Yeah, no, very good point. So, I mean, there are a few other arguments. I don't know how much we want to get into the other arguments, but most people watching right now are clearly on our side with this. But okay, let's see here. How about the counter argument? This is actually one I've kind of gone back and forth on, so I'm interested in your take. Some folks worry that the leadership power would actually increase if, obviously right now it's very difficult if you want your bill to pass, for example, any of your bills to pass, you kind of have to suck up to the leadership, and you have to there's so many bills and very few actually even make it to committee, and even fewer make it to a vote. And they have that gatekeeping power, the leadership of each of the House. So some argue that that leadership would actually be worse if you had more members. What are your thoughts on that?
So I think that's really a separate issue from size.
Okay.
I think in any form of parliamentary government, there's rules about how do we govern ourselves? How do we decide who's going to be on committees? How do our campaign finance structures work, and the sorts of incentives of, what are the quids and what are the quos that we can quid pro quo each other? So I think all of those structures is worth a healthy debate. But I think if the argument is that is purely a function of size, I guess at one extreme, if you want to make leaders really powerful, have one member, right? And the leader's really powerful.
Yeah, I know, right?
At the other extreme, if you look at every parliamentary democracy in the world and just ask how many people does an elected official represent in that democracy, there are only two that represent more people than we do in the United States. And
India.
I think India, and I want to say Afghanistan, maybe. They're weird. It's a weird.
Which, by the way, India is increasing the number of representatives they have.
Yeah. So there's plenty of bodies. I mean, like the UK has almost as many people in their parliament as we do, and has a fraction of our population. And so the idea that somehow, expanding, representation creates problems for leadership. If that was a problem, you would see that in other countries around the world, right? And so I think the better argument is to say, in the ways that the United States is really an outlier, what do we gain from being an outlier? And what does it cost us to be an outlier? Because then at least we've got we've got a more direct comparison, but with the caveat that we still have to look and say, well, they have some different rules about their own sort of internal policies and how they organize themselves that may make them a little bit different. But I just think it's very hard to look at the data. And even if you look at individual states, there are individual states where the state houses represent vastly fewer people than we do, and have much larger relative size members of their state houses and state senates. So if this was a problem, you'd be seeing it there.
Yeah. Somebody in the chat earlier mentioned New Hampshire. How many reps are in New Hampshire? There's a lot.
Yeah, I think they each represent like 12 people.
Yeah. I mean, to me, it does seem like the more members you have, the more difficult it would be for special interest groups and rich donors to control individual members. Would you agree with that? I say that a lot, but I don't know if it's necessarily true.
I don't know if it's true or it's not. I mean, look, it still is a representative democracy. You still have to get elected. You're still going to have coalitions that form, in interesting and, ways that sort of, not to be all foundersy about this, but our founders wrote, they didn't contemplate the idea of parties, but they were deeply concerned about factions, right? Mm-hmm. And the idea that once you get a representative group of people together, they're going to naturally congeal around issues that matter to them. And so, members from areas with a lot of federal land are going to have certain commonalities of interest that, members who represent urban cores are going to be different. That's fine. Like, that's the whole idea of a representative democracy. I think I would assume that regardless of the number of members, if you're a lobbyist, if you're a corporate interest, and whatever your interest is, you are naturally going to understand where are the factions that are naturally responsive to your sets of issues, where are the factions that are kind of on the bubble but could be persuaded. And we can look at that through a very sort of tawdry campaign finance abuses kind of way, or just look at that and say, well, that's kind of innate to a representative government. You got to find out who are the people who represent your interests and try to elevate them and try to elevate their issues. And, in a lot of ways, that's a positive thing.
Yeah. I know Citizens United is a whole separate issue too, money in politics, which, you get into some First Amendment debates. But I feel like this is just something that already constitutional. We can already solve it. It's boring. And maybe that kind of leads to my next thing here, because I want to kind of finish things off here looking at, I don't know, the more I learn about this, and I'm just like, why has this not happened after nearly 100 years? Okay, let's just go back to the page on GovTrack here. I'm just going to share the screen again. And this kind of made me laugh when I first saw it here. But if you look at this page, it says prognosis, 0% chance of being enacted. And they have this whole formula here, like 1%.
Mean.
I'm sorry, I don't do this to be mean. I'm just saying, okay, like this is where the challenge is. So I guess my next question to you is, why is this not taking off? Like, what are the challenges, the obstacles that you're facing trying to move this bill forward?
Well, look, let me just start on, I don't know how GovTrack's algorithm works, but I'll bet you dollars to donuts that a part of the reason why it shows so low is because we just don't have a lot of co-sponsors right now. So if people are watching this and they like the bill, call your rep, encourage them to get on the bill. The more people we have on it, particularly on the right committees of jurisdiction, that gets important and increases the odds. I also think, and I don't want to be so self-serving about this, but there are things that matter to voters. And when we go out and poll our constituents and say, what matters to you? Those are the things that we necessarily go out and try to focus on. In the current era, what are the things that matters to voters? The assaults on our democracy, what's going on with ICE, what's happening to our healthcare system, the costs at the grocery store, all those things matter. And so you have members of Congress who are saying, I got to really dedicate my bandwidth to those issues that matter to the voters right now. If they don't hear about this issue, they'll deal with it after they deal with all the other stuff. So there's a real value just in reaching out to your representative or your senator and saying, I care about this issue. This matters to me. I think it's a good way to fix. And that starts to create, a certain amount of inertia of its own. I also think, and, I'd sort of put the question back to you as a historian. When this, as you were saying, the reasons that this got put in place 100 years ago had a lot to do with the urbanization of America 100 years ago, that had a strong racial contingent to it of where it goes on right now. And we are also at a moment right now, over the last 30 years, where we have seen a similar, real weakening of the economy in rural America and people moving to urban areas. And so some of those same political tensions where folks in those communities that have been left behind in some of the ways with where our economy is going are feeling a little bit left out. And so the same reasons that made this a threat 100 years ago that caused Congress to cap the size of the House to protect those folks who felt left behind, some of those same dynamics are out there right now. And I think that just requires all of us to acknowledge that regardless of where you live, regardless of what's happened to the economy in your community, we're all Americans. We all have a vested interest in this, and we all succeed when our democracy becomes more representative. I think it's very hard to get legislation like this to succeed if we say, well, you voted for the wrong person last cycle, and your district doesn't share my district's values, and I'm a better American than you are. Mm. And so I think we have sort of a collective responsibility to say, can we articulate a vision of America that's broad enough to include everybody, and that acknowledges as the table stakes that everybody who we've been most proud of in our history are people who have expanded democracy, not people who've shrunk it.
Yeah, that's a really good point. Rural America has been screwed over for so long. I almost feel like we just have to start paying people to live in rural communities or something. But anyway, I don't want to get sidetracked too much on this. The way I sell this reform is this reform solves almost every other reform that you want. Like whatever you are passionate about. Okay, you're worried the most about inflation, cost of living. Okay, if you have better representation, there can be better reforms down the line to fix that, whatever it is. So I get that this is not something. This is more of a root cause or root. This is a root cause, and people are. It seems like people are focused on symptoms. Even the politicians are always like putting out fires. Have you had any success with amongst your own colleagues, like even within your own party in Illinois? Has any of them, have you shared this bill with them, and what are their responses to this?
Look, we've had these conversations with a lot of groups. There's a handful of us who are, and I don't even know if all these people have sponsored the bill, but I think there's a handful of members of Congress who are sort of the good government true believers. Earl Blumenauer from Oregon was one of those, and he retired, his Maxine Dexter, who now serves that seat, is wonderful, but she comes with a different suite of issues. Don Beyer from Virginia has been one of these good government types. John Sarbanes was, and of course he retired. And so it's sort of, there's just a handful of members who articulate this as well as you did, of this is sort of one of those root cause issues. John Sarbanes spent much of his career saying we have got to deal with campaign finance reform and getting rid of gerrymandering. And ultimately that got to enough critical mass that became H.R. 1, the first bill that Speaker Pelosi introduced in the 116th Congress, and then was also the first bill introduced in the 117th Congress. Both times it died in the Senate. That's a whole separate conversation. But I think the more we can sort of build that, as you put it, that this is sort of a table stakes issue and everything else is on the table, that gets through. So to your question, yes, there's a lot of members who are supportive on this, and there are a lot of members who look at it and say, yeah, you're one of those weird good government guys. It's nice that you prioritize this, but I got other issues I'm going to dealing with. I enjoy talking with you about it. It seems like it makes sense, but this is not something that I'm getting a lot of pressure on from home. So I got to focus on some other issues. And I'm not judging. I'm just saying that, we contain multitudes.
Do you think you can get some co-sponsors for it?
We're gonna keep pushing. This is the second term we've introduced it, and we get a few more each time. So
yeah,
we'll keep pushing. But I mean, now that I'm on the Mr. Beat podcast, it's gonna blow up.
Yeah. Okay. So I did. Okay. I've told you before. My audience knows that I've been trying to reach my own congressman, Tracy Mann in Kansas, who seems like a very nice guy, by the way. I should say that. But obviously this is not something important to him. And even I will say, I was like, okay, fine. I'll start reaching out to other members of the House in my state. So for example, Sharice Davids, she represents the district next to me, like a few miles away. I don't think it's something she's even never thought of. I don't think she cares about it either. So I think what this is all leading up to is I feel like we have a responsibility as just ordinary constituent citizens to just tell everybody we know about this, right? Is it kind of on us?
I'll tell you, I'm half tempted. Sharice is a good friend, and her office is literally right across the hall from mine. I'm half tempted to pick up this computer and walk over there.
I did get in touch with her media person. Hopefully, we're going to have fingers crossed have an interview.
Yeah.
But yeah,
again, there's not hostility. It's just is this a priority? And this is, I think, these types of reforms. In hindsight, we always tell ourselves that the big structural reforms to democracy came from the top down because of some great leader. In truth, they always come from the bottom up. And eventually someone takes credit, right? So, right? I mean, that's the truth of social movements, right?
Yeah, like Teddy Roosevelt took credit for all the trust busting and progressive, but man, it was happening decades before. Okay, sorry.
Yeah, no, but LBJ signs the Civil Rights Act.
Yeah.
Does that happen if all the grassroots efforts, going, not just the Martin Luther King and the Rosa Parks, but long before that, if all that hadn't happened, it's not like LBJ said, if you elect me to be vice president so that I can be in with appropriate tragedy strikes to become president, I'll sign the Civil Rights Act. That wasn't the promise. I think he appropriately gets credit for using his position of power at that time to facilitate those protections and expansions of our democracy. But that happened because ultimately it came from the bottom up and created political pressure that he had to respond to. And I think this is in that category of good government reforms.
Well, this is a great way to kind of wrap this up then. So if you are listening to this, watching this right now, please check out, the link is in the description, check out HR 4125, the Equal Voices Act, sponsored by Representative Casten, who thank you, Representative Casten, for taking the time to speak to us today about this bill. You have a growing army on your side, so everybody listening, if you support this, if you support expanding the House of Representatives, also known as Uncap the House, write your own representative. You don't have to write mine anymore. For a while, they were writing mine, Tracy Mann, because he wasn't responding. I'm like, no, that's okay. Stop bugging him. I want you to bug your own representative. Preferably call them, write a letter, not just send them an email. And is there any advice for somebody contacting their own representative, Representative Casten, that you want to give to them?
No, I mean, I think just be aware that I think, the average office probably gets, 1,000 incoming comments about something. You should vote this way on this bill. I'm concerned about this. 1,000 a week, 1,000 a month. And a lot of those are, well, don't assume that a non-response means they don't care. But also assume that, like, you've got to have a certain volume that comes up to say, okay, this is a significant thing that makes a lot of sense. And it's not just crass of this has to resonate. Sometimes it's just finding a member who say, this actually really ties with something that I personally care about. And there's a personal connection. I think some of the things that have had the most impact on us, that we actually led the effort after that to make legislative reform, were calls from constituents that maybe it was just one constituent, but it was someone who could very articulately make the case why this is really important and was very persuasive. So it's communication 101, right? People fall in love for emotional reasons and then they rationalize them after the fact. So give them some good emotional reasons to support this.
It's not a very sexy issue. It's not something that we can use emotions very easily with. So we're going to have to get creative, folks. But regardless, I want to thank you personally, Representative Casten, for writing this bill. I'm so glad that I found out about it. And from this moment forward, I'm going to be specifically promoting your bill, not just because before I found out about it, I was just saying uncap the House. I didn't even have anything specific. So yeah, like, I hope that this gains momentum, and I wish you the very best with this.
Thanks a bunch. And I guess we can measure our success by when that little ticker goes above 0%, we know we're succeeding.
Yeah.
Keep the scoreboard in the corner and we'll see how we're doing.
Yeah. Okay. Well, maybe at some point in the future, we can check back in and have better news, more momentum. But thanks for being a guest on this stream.
Thanks so much. Appreciate it.
All right. And